I arrived at the lighthouse just as the last rays of daylight sank below the horizon, casting the vast ocean into a growing darkness. The old structure loomed above me, towering like a forgotten sentinel. It had stood there for over a century, its light long extinguished, leaving it as nothing more than a hollow relic of another era. My phone blinked with the last traces of reception, and I instinctively glanced at the dwindling signal bars. This place was isolated, even for me, and I had to admit that choosing this abandoned lighthouse as the subject of my photography project suddenly felt like a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The eerie quietness around me was palpable, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant crashing of waves. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I reached for it, the heavy wooden door protesting against its rusted hinges as I stepped inside. The air was stale and thick, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and mildew. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the hollow chamber as I made my way through the small entry hall and into the main room. Dust and debris littered the floor, and the remnants of old furniture sat like forgotten ghosts of the past. Something felt off, but I tried to brush it away as nerves. After all, old buildings have their way of getting under your skin. I set up my camera by one of the tall windows that overlooked the ocean, hoping to capture the desolate beauty of the place before the light completely vanished. As I focused the lens, a soft thud echoed from somewhere above me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The wind? The old beams shifting? Maybe an animal that had made this place its home. But the thudding came again, louder this time. My pulse quickened as I glanced toward the spiral staircase that wound its way up to the top of the lighthouse. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. No answer, only silence. I debated whether to investigate or leave. But something about the sound, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Against my better judgment, I started climbing the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The air seemed to grow colder the higher I went, and the dim light filtering in from the small windows grew weaker. As I reached the top, the thudding stopped. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the small, circular room at the top of the lighthouse. I was not alone. In the far corner of the room was a cage, an old, rusted iron cage. And inside was a man. His long, matted gray hair hung over his face, his body frail and bent, as though he had been sitting there for years. His clothes were tattered, hanging from his bony frame like they were from another time. He stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, hands clutching the iron bars as if he expected me to free him. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Who are you?" My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately, just kept watching me, his breath shallow and rasping. "They left me here," he finally croaked, his voice like sandpaper, rough and broken. "They locked me up, and they never came back." My stomach twisted with unease. I scanned the room again, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could have done this? Why would anyone leave someone here, in a place so forgotten and isolated? I'm going to call someone," I stammered, fumbling for my phone, but I already knew there was no signal. "No one's coming," the old man rasped, his voice rising with a sudden urgency. "They don't come anymore. They've left us." I glanced toward the stairs, panic starting to rise. Something was wrong, horribly wrong, but I couldn't just leave him. "How long have you been here?" I asked, trying to stay calm, even though the cold sweat had already begun forming on my forehead. "I don't know," he whispered. "The light was still shining when they put me here." I blinked. The light? The lighthouse hadn't been operational in over 50 years. There was no way this man had been here for that long. was there? Before I could say another word, the old man began to laugh, a low, hollow laugh that echoed unervingly off the walls. His thin fingers clutched tighter to the bars. "They'll come for you too," he wheezed between fits of laughter. "They always do." Suddenly, the room grew colder, as if the very air was being sucked out. A suffocating pressure settled over me, and I felt the walls closing in. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I stood frozen, transfixed by the old man's chilling grin, his laughter growing louder, more deranged. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in, and the darkness around me deepened. The old man's laughter seemed to come from all directions now, echoing in the stairwell, bouncing off the walls. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the stairs. My heart raced as I descended, faster and faster, the old man's cackling chasing me, filling the lighthouse like an unrelenting specter. I couldn't get out fast enough. When I finally reached the ground floor, I threw the door open and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a wall, and for a moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath, the eerie silence settling back over the lighthouse. I looked up at the towering structure, its darkened windows staring back at me like empty eyes. Somewhere at the top, I knew the old man was still there, locked in his cage, laughing. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been waiting for me. The fisherman didn't meet my eyes as we neared the island. His weathered hands gripped the wheel of the boat, and the wind tugged at his faded cap. The fog thickened, making the jagged shoreline ahead look like a shadow in the mist. "You're sure you want to go here?" he muttered, his voice low and hoarse. "Most people don't return." I raised an eyebrow. "Why? What happened here?" He didn't answer right away. His sunken eyes flicked toward the island again, as though he expected something, someone, to be waiting for us. "It's that village," he finally said. "It was abandoned long ago, but some say it isn't empty." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he cut the engine before I could. The boat rocked gently against the dock, and he gestured for me to step out. "Last ferry leaves at sunset. Be here, or you'll be stuck." With a knot forming in my gut, I stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking beneath my feet. Before I could ask anything else, the fisherman gave me one last grim look and pushed off into the fog. I was alone. The island looked worse than I expected. The small village that had once housed a thriving fishing community was now a cluster of decaying buildings, overgrown with wild brush. Everything was still too still. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. The wind tugged at the edges of my jacket as I made my way up the narrow, overgrown path. Each step felt heavier, like the island was pressing down on me, warning me to leave. But I couldn't turn back now, not without any photographs for my project. The first house I passed was a crumbling wreck, its roof half collapsed. As I raised my camera to capture the desolate scene, movement caught my eye. From one of the shattered windows, a face peered out at me, pale, wide-eyed, and slack-jawed. I froze. For a moment, the figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me. "Hello," I called, stepping closer. The face disappeared from the window. I swallowed hard and moved past the house. A chill crept down my spine. There were supposed to be no inhabitants here, just ruins. The wind whispered through the trees, but something else joined it, the faint sound of voices. I quickened my pace, heading deeper into the village. The path narrowed as I passed more houses, their windows black holes gaping out at me. More faces appeared, watching from the shadows, but when I turned to look directly, they would slip out of sight, their eyes always fixed on me. As I approached the center of the village, the strange whispers grew louder, echoing off the dilapidated walls. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like chanting, low and rhythmic like a prayer. My heart pounded as I reached the village square. There, in the middle of the overgrown square, stood a group of people. Their clothes were ragged, their faces gaunt and expressionless. They stood in a tight circle, heads bowed, hands linked, and they were chanting. I hesitated at the edge of the square, unsure if I should approach them. "Hello!" My voice came out shaky, and immediately their heads snapped up. Their eyes locked on me, blank and cold. The chanting stopped. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. These people, they didn't look real. Their eyes were too wide, their movements too stiff. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. One of them, a man with hollow cheeks and cracked lips, stepped forward. His voice came out raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. "You shouldn't have come." I swallowed, my throat dry. I didn't know anyone lived here. He smiled, a tight, unnatural smile. "We've been waiting." The others stepped forward in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were used to doing this. A sudden wave of panic gripped me. I turned, ready to bolt back the way I came, but the path behind me was blocked. More of them had appeared, slipping silently out of the houses, closing in on me. My chest tightened as they surrounded me, their eyes never blinking. I backed up, stumbling over the uneven ground. The fisherman's warning echoed in my mind. I had to leave. "Now, I'll go," I said, raising my hands. "I'll leave." They said nothing, just kept stepping closer. The man who had spoken reached out a hand. His fingers were gnarled and filthy, the skin stretched tight over his bones. "Stay with us," he murmured, almost kindly, like he was offering me a gift. I spun on my heel and ran. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I sprinted down the path, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. They were following, their movements quick and silent now, like they had been waiting for me to run. The dock came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last sliver of light fading from the sky. I saw the boat waiting, the fisherman standing on deck, his face grim as he waved me toward him. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs burned as I ran, every instinct screaming at me to keep going. I threw myself onto the dock, leaping into the boat just as the fisherman pulled away from the island. As the boat sped away, I finally dared to glance back. The figures stood at the edge of the dock, their pale faces glowing faintly in the twilight, watching in silence, waiting for the next fool to come. The fisherman didn't speak until the island was barely a shadow on the horizon. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're lucky," he said. "Most don't make it back." It was nearly midnight, and I was the last person in the laundromat. I usually didn't come this late, but with my work schedule, I barely had time to breathe, let alone wash a mountain of clothes. The place was quiet, save for the constant whir of the washing machines and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The laundromat itself wasn't much to look at, dingy, run down, and the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The linoleum floors were cracked, and the windows had a layer of grime thick enough to block out most of the streetlight. Still, it was cheap, and it was the only place open this late. I loaded my clothes into the washer, slipped in the coins, and found a seat near the front. The man behind the counter, a guy in his late 50s with a permanent scowl etched into his face, barely looked up. He'd been flipping through a magazine since I got there, not interested in anything but getting through his shift. That's when I noticed him. There was another man sitting at the far end of the laundromat in a row of plastic chairs. His clothes were wrinkled, a half-filled laundry basket at his feet. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the spinning machines, but there was something off about him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe the way he sat so still, or how he didn't seem to blink. But what really struck me was that I hadn't noticed him come in. I had been the only one here when I started my load, right? I glanced back at the guy behind the counter, but he didn't seem to care. Shaking it off, I settled into my chair and pulled out my phone, mindlessly scrolling through my feed. After a while, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced up, and sure enough, the man at the end was no longer looking at the machines. He was looking at me, not staring exactly, more like observing. His eyes were dark, and his face expressionless, like he wasn't really looking at me, but through me. I quickly turned back to my phone, my skin crawling. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe I was reading too much into it. After all, it was late, and people got weird when they were tired. I convinced myself it was nothing and kept scrolling, but I couldn't focus. A few minutes later, I felt a shift in the room. The guy had moved closer. Now he was sitting just a few seats away from me, staring down at his feet like nothing was out of the ordinary. I hadn't heard him get up. My chest tightened. He was too close now, way closer than anyone would sit in an empty laundromat. I glanced at him again, trying to gauge if I was overreacting. He didn't look threatening, just off. His clothes were worn, his hands fidgeting slightly in his lap. But it was his eyes that made my stomach flip. They were still glued to the floor, his lips slightly parted, as if he was muttering something to himself. His breathing seemed wrong, shallow, uneven. I stood up, pretending to stretch. I needed space, and sitting there next to him felt suffocating. I walked toward the machine, checking my clothes, though the cycle still had plenty of time left. As I bent down, I could feel his eyes on my back. I turned just slightly to confirm it. He was staring again, not even trying to hide it this time. His head was tilted ever so slightly to the side, his mouth barely moving like he was muttering something under his breath. My heart started racing. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just one of those oddball types. But it wasn't just the staring. It was the way he had moved without a sound, how close he'd gotten without me noticing. I started wondering if he was going to do something, if I should leave. I made a beeline for the counter. "Excuse me," I said, louder than I intended, to get the attention of the man behind it. The guy finally looked up, bored and disinterested. "That guy back there," I said, nodding toward the far end. "He's acting strange." The attendant sighed, rolling his eyes like this was the last thing he wanted to deal with at midnight. He looked over at the man in the chairs and shrugged. "He's harmless, regular, comes in every night." That didn't make me feel any better. Why would someone come here every night without any laundry? I felt a pit forming in my stomach. "He's just sitting there," I muttered, feeling stupid for even bringing it up. "Yeah, well, people are weird," the guy behind the counter muttered before going back to his magazine. "No help at all." I glanced back, and sure enough, the man had moved even closer. I was out of options. My laundry wasn't done yet, but I decided I didn't care. I didn't want to stay here a second longer. I grabbed my laundry basket and quickly stuffed my clothes inside, damp and unfinished. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I avoided the man's gaze. When I passed him on the way to the door, his head turned slightly, and I could feel him watching me go, watching closely. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, but I didn't stop. I walked quickly, my shoes slapping against the sidewalk, and only then did I risk glancing back through the laundromat window. He was standing now, right where I'd been sitting, his body completely still, head turned toward the door as if waiting for me to come back. I didn't look again. I kept walking. I never minded staying late at the library. I was a grad student, and between juggling work and school, it was often the only time I could get some peace and quiet to study. The university library was old. Creaky floors, towering bookshelves, and a strange draft that made the place feel colder than it should be. But it was my sanctuary. It was almost 10 p.m., closing time, and I was one of the last people there. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, gave me her usual, "You better not stay past hours" glance as she packed up her things. She never spoke much, just that curt nod as she walked past, her heels echoing against the polished wood floor. I had another hour of studying in me, but I figured I could sneak in some extra time. After Mrs. Hargrove locked the main doors, I could let myself out the side exit that always stayed unlocked until morning. I wasn't the only student who had discovered that loophole. The library was almost too quiet after she left. I stretched and packed up my notes, preparing to shift my study session to a more comfortable corner in the reading room. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like paper being shuffled. I froze listening. The library was supposed to be empty. I peered down the aisles, but no one was there. Just rows and rows of silent books, watching over me like sentinels. Shaking off the unease, I grabbed my backpack and headed for the reading room, figuring maybe another student had the same idea about staying late. The reading room was my favorite spot. It had plush chairs, dim lamps, and that old book smell that made you feel like you were in a different century. But tonight something felt wrong. The lamp in the corner flickered as I entered the room, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, half hidden behind one of the towering bookshelves, just a flicker of movement, like someone ducking out of sight. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't alone. I told myself it was probably another student, maybe someone who didn't want to get caught either. But my gut told me something else. The rustling sound came again, followed by a low murmur, like someone was whispering. I crept toward the back of the room, my footsteps light on the worn carpet. The dim light made the shadows twist and stretch, playing tricks on my eyes. I reached the shelf where I thought I'd seen the figure and peeked around. No one, just rows of books, neatly stacked and untouched. But there was something off about one of them, an old leather-bound volume sticking out slightly. I don't know why I reached for it, but I did. The moment my fingers brushed the spine, the whispering stopped. My blood ran cold. I yanked my hand back, but the book, it shifted on its own, sliding out an inch further. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but a wave of dread washed over me. Then the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. It wasn't one voice. It was many, faint, indistinct, like a conversation you could only half hear. I stepped back, suddenly desperate to leave. Before I could turn, the lights went out. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim glow to find my way back to the reading room's entrance. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, filling the dark space with a rising chorus of unintelligible voices. I had to get out. I bolted for the exit, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand was on the doorknob when the sound of footsteps behind me made me freeze. Heavy, slow footsteps, approaching steadily from the darkness. I turned around, the light from my phone barely cutting through the blackness. But I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the light, its face shrouded in shadow. But its eyes, they were wide, and they were staring straight at me. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I turned and ran for the side exit, throwing the door open with trembling hands. The cold night air hit me like a shock, and I didn't stop running until I was halfway across campus. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I made it to my dorm, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door behind me, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just some strange coincidence. I pulled out my phone to text my roommate about what happened, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. On my screen, there was a photo taken in the dark library just moments before I ran out. And in the background, the figure with wide, unblinking eyes was standing. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When I signed up for the prison internship, I thought it would be a great stepping stone in my career. The prison I was assigned to was an old, nearly abandoned maximum security facility deep in the woods. It had been mostly decommissioned, but parts of the structure were still used for storage. Everyone had heard the stories. Inmates who disappeared, strange sightings by the guards, but I chalked it up to rumors. I didn't believe in haunted places. On my second night, I was assigned to help Sam, an old supervisor, organize archived records in the unused section of the prison. This part had been closed for decades. The walls were damp, and the lights overhead flickered constantly. "This place is creepy, but it's just old," Sam said, shrugging. He seemed comfortable there, but I was on edge. Every step echoed unnervingly down the narrow halls. The air felt thick, like the entire place had been sealed off from the world for too long. We reached the records room, deep in the oldest wing, and Sam left me alone to work. The silence was stifling. As I sorted through the dusty files, I heard a soft clinking sound from somewhere behind me. I paused, listening. It sounded like chains being dragged. "Sam?" I called out. No answer. My skin prickled with unease. The clinking grew louder, accompanied by slow, deliberate footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I stepped into the hallway. The light barely cut through the thick shadows ahead. "Sam?" I called again, but all I heard were those footsteps. They were close now, coming from just around the corner. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to check. Slowly, I peeked around the corner. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, trying to laugh it off. Old pipes, old building. That's all it is. But as I turned back, the sound started again, right behind me. I ran. My footsteps echoed wildly down the hall as I sprinted back toward the main corridor. But just as I turned the final corner, I ran into Sam. "Whoa, what's wrong?" he asked, grabbing my arm. I was shaking, gasping for breath. "There's something back there," I stammered. In the hallway, I heard it. Chain's footsteps. Sam frowned but didn't laugh. Instead, he flicked on his flashlight. "Stay close to me," he said. His tone was more serious than I expected, and for the first time, I saw real concern in his eyes. We started making our way back toward the exit, but those dragging footsteps followed us. Every time we sped up, the footsteps quickened too. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my throat tight. "Keep moving," Sam muttered, his voice low and tense. We reached the final hallway. The exit was just ahead, when suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. We stopped dead in our tracks. A long, low-moan rumble from behind the door, like someone or something was trapped on the other side. "What the hell?" Sam breathed, rushing to the door and yanking on the handle. It didn't budge. I grabbed the other side, pulling with him. Together, we threw the door open and stepped into the same hallway. I blinked in disbelief. We hadn't escaped. The hallway stretched out before us, dark and endless, the same flickering lights casting shadows on the floor. We were still inside. "Wait, we just came from here," I said, panic rising in my voice. My stomach twisted with fear. Sam looked just as pale as I felt. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This can't be right." But the door behind us had vanished. The shadows around us seemed to stretch longer, darker, and the dragging footsteps, they hadn't stopped. They were still behind us. Sam turned toward me, his face tight with fear. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" And then the footsteps stopped. Right behind us. The cabin seemed perfect on the website, secluded deep in the woods of northern Maine and miles away from civilization. I thought it would be the ideal escape from the noise of my life. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and the stillness of nature. Exactly what I needed, or so I thought. From the moment I stepped out of the car, something felt wrong. The silence was unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no wind, just the oppressive stillness that swallowed every sound. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and dark, with the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. As I unpacked inside, that feeling of being watched began to grow. It started subtly, a prickle at the back of my neck like eyes were on me. I brushed it off at first. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, right? It was just nerves, but the weight of it wouldn't go away. I kept catching myself looking out the window, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. The empty forest stared back. I lit a fire, trying to relax, but every crackle of the logs sounded wrong, too loud in the oppressive quiet. The shadows stretched long across the floor, creeping toward me with each flicker of the flames. I needed to shake it off. I grabbed my jacket and decided to go for a walk, just a short one to clear my head. The sun was dipping low, casting the trees in long shadows, but the air outside felt even thicker than inside. As soon as I stepped out, the sensation hit me again, harder this time. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching me. The weight of their gaze was constant, pressing down on me from the trees, from behind the cabin, from everywhere. I forced myself to walk further down the path, but my steps felt too loud, like whoever or whatever was watching could hear everything. After a few minutes, I turned back, unable to ignore the growing panic. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming now, like there was something just behind me, too close. I glanced back over my shoulder. Nothing, but I knew. I could feel it. I sped up, walking quickly toward the cabin, the sensation that something was keeping pace with me, just out of sight. Every shadow felt too dark, every tree too still. My heart was racing by the time I reached the door. Inside, the silence was unbearable. I locked the door behind me, trying to steady my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought whatever was watching me back with me. It was still out there, lurking just beyond the windows, waiting for me to let my guard down. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow felt too long, too solid, like it was watching me from the corners of the room. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, but I couldn't stop the creeping paranoia. I was being hunted. The hours dragged on, and I felt trapped, like the walls of the cabin were closing in. The fire was dying, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a figure peering in from the darkness. Something was out there. I knew it. And then I heard a footstep on the porch. My heart froze. Someone was outside. I wasn't imagining it. The sound was deliberate, slow, heavy. It paused at the door. I could feel the pressure of their presence, like they were testing the door, seeing if I would react. I held my breath, trying to stay perfectly still. Maybe they would go away. Maybe this was all in my head. But then I heard it. The doorknob rattling, softly at first, then more insistent. My stomach dropped. They were trying to get in. The footsteps moved again, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tight as I stood there, my back against the wall. I couldn't breathe. I could hear them moving from window to window, pausing like they were checking each one, watching me from outside. I was being hunted. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't just sit there. I crept to the window, my body trembling, and peeked through the curtains, expecting to see someone right outside. But the porch was empty. No one was there. I didn't have time to process what that meant before I heard the door creak behind me. I spun around, my pulse spiking, but the room was empty. The door was wide open. They were inside. The amusement park had been shut down for years. No one really knew why, but rumors circulated, accidents, safety violations, disappearances. When Jason suggested we check it out, I wasn't thrilled, but he pushed, saying it would make for great footage. Urban exploration was his thing, not mine. But there we were, standing outside the rusted gates of the abandoned park, my stomach already tight with unease. The park loomed over us, the skeletal remains of rides casting twisted shadows in the fading daylight. Jason was already buzzing with excitement, camera in hand. "Let's split up and cover more ground," he said, his grin wide. "We'll meet back here in an hour." I hesitated. "That's a bad idea. What if something goes wrong?" "Relax," Jason said, waving me off. "It's just an old park. What could happen?" Reluctantly, I agreed, figuring we'd be in and out in no time. I watched as Jason darted off toward the old roller coaster while I headed toward the funhouse. The air felt thick with neglect, and as I walked through the overgrown paths, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The funhouse was falling apart. Graffiti covered the walls, and the entrance was half collapsed, but I squeezed through, using my phone's flashlight to guide me. The inside was a maze of shattered mirrors and rotting wood. The smell of decay hung in the air, mixing with dampness that seemed to seep into everything. I was halfway through the first room when I heard it, a distant muffled shout. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Jason," I called, my voice echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I moved toward the sound, stepping carefully through the narrow corridors of the funhouse. The shouting grew louder, more frantic. My stomach twisted with fear. Something was wrong. Finally, I reached the back exit of the funhouse, where the sound was clearest. I stepped out into the open, and that's when I saw him. Jason was running, full speed, panic all over his face. He bolted toward me, but just before he reached the door, he tripped. I watched in horror as he slammed to the ground, his camera skidding across the cracked pavement. "Jason!" I screamed, rushing toward him. That's when I saw what he was running from. Two men, dressed in old maintenance uniforms, were closing in fast. They had come out of nowhere, their faces twisted with a cold, calculated determination. Jason tried to scramble to his feet, but they were on him before he could stand. I stood there, frozen in place, as one of them grabbed Jason by the collar and pulled him back, slamming him hard against the ground. The sound of Jason's head hitting the concrete made my stomach turn. My mind raced, paralyzed with shock. I wanted to help him, to do something, but the sheer brutality of what was happening before me rooted me to the spot. The other man reached into his pocket, pulling out what looked like a length of rope. "Don't!" Jason's voice was cut off as they looped the rope around his neck. I stepped forward, my voice barely a whisper, "Stop!" But they didn't. Jason's eyes found mine for a split second, wide with terror, before the rope tightened. I watched as they dragged him back, deeper into the shadows of the park, his body limp and motionless. I backed up, my chest tight, barely able to breathe. What the hell was happening? My mind couldn't process it. Jason was just gone. I stumbled back into the funhouse, slamming the door behind me. I was alone now, and they knew I was here. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I could still hear the faint rustling of leaves outside, footsteps fading into the distance as they disappeared with Jason. My hands were shaking as I crouched in the corner of the funhouse, trying to make myself as small as possible. I had to get out. I knew I couldn't stay here, but every inch of my body was paralyzed with fear. I waited, listening. After a few minutes, I convinced myself they had gone. But just as I stood up, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the door of the funhouse. They were coming back. I bolted for the far side of the building, ducking behind a stack of broken mirrors. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear the door creak as it opened, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing them not to find me. The silence was unbearable, and my mind raced with images of what they'd done to Jason. My body was trembling with fear. They were looking for me. Footsteps moved slowly inside the funhouse. I could hear them approaching, stepping carefully through the debris. Then they stopped, right next to where I was hiding. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped. I could hear them breathing, could almost feel them standing over me. I opened my eyes, and there they were, both men, staring down at me with cold, blank expressions. Found you. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a weekend getaway to clear my head. The long stretches of empty highway, the soft hum of the car beneath me, it all felt like the perfect escape from work and stress. I had been driving for hours, the sun long gone, leaving the road ahead lit only by my headlights. The route I'd chosen was a backroad highway, one of those lonely stretches of asphalt that seemed to go on forever. No towns, no gas stations, just miles of darkness and solitude. It didn't bother me at first. I liked the quiet, the isolation, but the further I drove, the more I felt a creeping sense of unease. I hadn't seen another car in hours. Not one. Just me and the empty road. I glanced at the gas gauge. Almost empty. Great, I muttered to myself. I should have filled up at the last town, but it was hours behind me now. The GPS didn't show a gas station for miles ahead either, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. As I rounded a bend, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, coming up fast. Too fast. The car seemed to come out of nowhere, its lights blinding in the darkness. I shifted nervously in my seat. There was no reason for anyone to be driving this fast out here. I signaled and pulled over to the right, giving them space to pass, but they didn't. The car stayed right behind me, their headlights bright and unrelenting. What the hell? I muttered, pressing my foot on the gas to put some distance between us. The car sped up with me, tailgating so close I could see the outline of the driver's face in the mirror, expressionless. My heart started to race. I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine growling as I gained speed, but the car behind me kept up, matching every move. The highway ahead stretched out endlessly, the blackness around us thick and suffocating. My breath came faster now, panic bubbling up. I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I pushed the car to its limit, speeding well past any sane number. The road felt narrower now, the darkness closing in on all sides. Suddenly, the car behind me swerved into the other lane, pulling up beside me. I glanced over, just for a second, and saw the driver, a man in his 40s, his face blank cold. He stared straight ahead, never once looking at me. His car started drifting closer, too close. He was trying to run me off the road. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, swerving back into the right lane. He followed, his car grazing the side of mine. The impact jolted me, and I fought to keep control. He bumped me again, harder this time. My tires skidded, and I felt the car start to fishtail. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding. The car behind me screeched to a stop, but he didn't get out. He just sat there, headlights glaring into my rear view. Waiting. I was trapped. The highway was deserted. No turn-offs. Nowhere to go but forward. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. I had no choice but to keep driving. Slowly, I eased my foot off the brake, and the car behind me followed, creeping forward at the same pace. He wasn't going to stop. The gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, and my phone, of course, had no signal. I couldn't outrun him. I couldn't call for help. I was alone. Then I saw it. Up ahead, a sign, gas station, 5 miles. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. 5 miles felt like a lifetime with this man tailing me. I pressed the gas again, speeding up as much as I dared. The headlights stayed glued to my rear bumper. The miles ticked by, each one slower than the last. Every minute felt like an hour, the tension unbearable. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. Safety. But the car behind me didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up. I swerved into the gas station parking lot, my tires screeching as I skidded to a stop. I half expected the other car to follow me in, but instead, it roared past, continuing down the highway at breakneck speed. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence in the car was deafening. When I finally managed to step out, I realized just how close I'd been to losing control, literally and mentally. The gas station was empty, just a single light flickering above the pumps. I shakily filled the tank, my heart still pounding in my chest. I was alive. I had made it, but the adrenaline wouldn't let me relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the car wasn't finished. As I pulled back onto the highway, heading toward the nearest town, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. But the road stayed clear. And for now, that was enough.
Hey there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you.